This is the Revell 196 scale U.S.S. Constitution model, and I'm going to see if I can build this thing. Curious if it's even possible to build this thing. Anyway, we'll see how far I get. This kit came out in the 70s, and it's a pretty poor quality kit. There's a lot of flash, a lot of the parts don't fit together, and a lot of the parts are fragile. One thing to note is I am not a sailing ship builder. I haven't built a sailing ship since I was a kid. So I really don't have any experience building sailing ships, and that's going to make this even more of a challenge. I was already partway through the build before I decided to make the video, so the first part of the video is going to be sort of a slideshow style. Later on we'll get to actual video of the build. Before any assembly, I did a lot of painting. For the hull, I started by spray painting it flat brown from Tamiya using an enamel spray can. Over that, I airbrushed Tester's Aircraft Interior Black. I wanted to weather my model, so over the black, I used a wash of brown artist oils. Anytime you use artist oils, you have to wait for it to dry for about a week. Once the wash had dried, I masked off the water line to paint the copper bottom. For the copper, I used a Vallejo copper with their metal series, and it's a three-step process. You use a black primer first, which is a gloss black, and then over the top of that, you airbrush the copper, and I use several coats for that. Over top of that is a varnish that protects the copper. Once all that had dried, I again applied a brown wash of artist oils. At this time, I also did the decorative detail painting. And I also had to add the white stripe for the gun deck. Painting white over black is always a bit of a challenge. I used a tube of artist acrylic titanium white, and I used specifically a heavy body acrylic, which I think is a little thicker and goes on a little thicker. I did get some brush strokes, so I do kind of wish that I had airbrushed the white and then masked it off and did the black and the copper, but I wasn't going to go back and change it. And then over top of that, I used a wash of brown artist oils. The disadvantage of weathering a ship like this is with every step there is some patching and sanding, and then you have to go back and do some repainting, and your repaint has to match the weathered look of the original paint. Here's a detail shot of the rudder, and you can see the wash on the black and also the wash over the copper. The copper itself is pretty impressive. Vallejo did a great job making that. When you spray it on, it looks really just like a brand new shiny penny. Then once I put the wash on, it dulled it down a bit. But overall, it was a great look. For the stern, you want to paint all of the decorative details before you do any assembly. In this picture, you can still see some touch-up patches where the weathering didn't match the original paint. You can also see the weathering over the white around the windows. The stern did not really fit that well to the hull. I did as much sanding and fitting as I could, but I still had a gap on this side in the cabin area. I decided not to paint the roof of the cabin gold. I thought that too much gold just made the whole thing look a little too gaudy. Here's a close-up of the cabin. At this point, the gun deck has been installed. The piece of masking tape that you see is holding in the thread that controls the rudder. The gun deck actually does not get glued to the hull. It is a floating piece, and if you glue it to the hull, you will not be able to assemble the top deck. What I did to support the ship while I was working on it is I took the two plastic supports that come with the kit, and I just took some plywood, the art plywood that you get at like Hobby Lobby, and some basswood strips, and I stuck them together close enough that this just fits in there snug so it doesn't fall out. Because I don't know what my final display mounting is going to be yet. And then I can stick the ship on something like that, move it around, do things, and so I have a nice support. So the phase I'm at now is putting the gun turret, not turret, but the gun doors on the sides. So I have these, I've painted them white on the outside and brown on the inside, and I'm just going to start putting these things together. So for the glue on these, I'm using this Plastizap. So it's kind of like super glue specifically for plastic. First step is to cut them off the sprue, of course. I want to scrape paint off of any areas that are going to get glue, so I get a really good adhesion. I want these things really glued on tight. I know they're going to get bumped around a little bit. The other thing I found is doing the first side, the pins that go in the slots are a little bit thick, especially with some paint that has filled up the slots from the previous painting. So I want to just file that off. There's also a lot of flash on the parts. This is not a well molded kit, and that's part of the challenge. Now the next thing I want to do is to scrape the edges of the paint here where there's going to be some glue. I do a great job, but I want to get at least some off. So these looked kind of like they were going to be a challenge, but the first side went pretty well. So we'll see what happens on the second side. And the first side they mostly held right in there. And already we're not off to a good start. I think this first hole, doesn't like to stick very well. I only had a few of the ports that the door didn't want to just stay up on its own once I put the glue on. Alright, skipping him, moving on to the next one. There we go, that's what we want to see. Here we are almost done with the gun deck. And these wooden poles are supposed to be lashed to the center of the gun deck. And I kind of tried to glue them together in a clump using super glue, and it seems to be working. It's taking a long time for the super glue to dry. Those four eyelets are supposed to be where they're lashed. You can put in rope to tie all the cannon together, but I just do not see how that is visible anywhere, so I don't think I'm going to do that. And the same as with these glue spots. There's some sloppy gluing going on there, which you might see, and I'm going to leave it. If you look here, you can see that the gun deck is not glued in, and I don't think it ever does get glued in. I think it stays loose and floating. One of the problems up at the front was I had to trim the wheels off of the cannons, off the bottom of the cannons, because it kind of sticks up here, and the barrel would have been too high in the port. So that's the end of really milestone number one in my mind, is getting up to the gun deck being done. So then we'll start on the main deck. Okay, back to slideshow portion of the video. Here I am putting on the main deck, and the lower deck, I never did cement the lower deck, do not cement the lower deck. It appears to me that if you do glue the lower deck into the hull, you will never be able to get the upper deck in place because you will not be able to pry the two hull halves apart enough to get it into place. So the main problem putting in the upper deck was that the hull halves were spread apart too far to support the deck. So I tried using clamps, and I couldn't really get clamps to fit to clamp the hull halves together to hold the upper deck. So what I came up with was this idea of using string, and I tied string around the hull, and then I put I glued the deck pieces in place to the hull, and to hold it together I tightened the string by sticking either an X-Acto knife or a dental tool through the string and then twisting it so that the string cinched up, and that squeezed the hull halves together and into the proper position, and then the glue would set like that and hold the hull together. I never did tie that down the cannons on the cannon deck, and it looks to me like it would have been impossible, and also it completely is not visible to see those ropes, so I think it was worth not doing that. Another problem you'll see here is there is a giant gap between the three sections of the upper deck. Here only the front and mid sections are in place, but you can see that there's a gap between the two. I did try and do some filling with some putty and sanding, but I didn't do a great job because I didn't want to remove all of the detail, all the wood detail, and also it's a really awkward position to get any sanding in there. But I did try to fill that. Finally, I kind of screwed up on the third section, the rear section of the upper deck. I actually squeezed the hull in too much, and the upper deck was just slightly elevated of where it's supposed to be. I might be able to provide a detailed shot of that or not, but it wasn't, well, it certainly wasn't anything correctable, but it isn't really too noticeable. To glue the upper deck to the hull, I used 30-minute epoxy. I used 30-minute because I wanted to have a longer working time, and I had plenty of time to wait for it to cure once I had wrapped the string and tightened up the string around the hull. Okay, we're back to doing some assembly video. So where we are right now is that I have the guns glued to the top deck. I did tie these guns to the top deck. I thought it would be really difficult, but it turned out to actually be pretty easy. I figured out a couple tricks, and the next step is to put the lifeboats in, and we're going to tie those down. So I'll show you the tricks I used to do the tying. Here and here are the gaps that were created by putting the three pieces of the deck together. So I sanded those, and my deck is actually two different colors airbrushed, and so I had to mask off all the black and re-airbrush the decks to cover up the sanding spots, to cover up the putty. And then I had to go in and do a bunch of touch-up painting, and then I gave it a spray of dull coat to hide any glue spots or whatever might be showing up. So periodically during the build I do touch-up painting and shoot some dull coat and things like that to cover up the mistakes. So the next step is to put in the lifeboats. So here are my lifeboats. For these I decided to do a paint chipping technique using the hairspray paint chipping technique, which I actually have never done the hairspray paint chipping technique. So this was my first try at it, and I like the way the boats turned out. It might be a little bit excessive, but I think it looks interesting. So in looking at this, trying to figure out which boats go here, it looks like it's the three boats that don't have the little eye hooks. So there's three other boats that have these little eye hooks. The ones that go here don't have those. So looking at this, it looks like the first thing I actually want to do is I'm going to stick the thread in three of these holes here. So I'm going to get started on that. So the first thing I want to do is take a dental pick and ream out the little eyelets where the rope is going to go. And make sure also that they are glued in secure. So I cut my piece of thread, and one of the tricks that I figured out is to dip the thread in water and get it wet. And that gets rid of some of the static electricity and makes the thread a little more workable. And I just use tweezers, loop it through the eyelet, tie it off. And then the next trick is I put a clothespin on the thread to keep tension on it. I stick a little toothpick and white glue, dab it on the knot, and that ties the knot. So there, using clothespins, that's how I keep the thread tight so the knot doesn't come untied while the glue dries. So that's what I did to tie the cannons on. So I would tie in one eyelet, let that eyelet dry, then wrap it around the cannon and tie in the other eyelet. And I think it took between 1 and 2 hours total time to tie in all the cannons for the upper deck. And I really think it helps with the appearance. I think it's worth going through that trouble to do that. So I'm going to finish pre-tying some of these knots, and then we'll come back and we'll glue the boats in. So here we have one side of each of the ropes tied down and held in place with clothespins. And looking at this, I think it's going to be easier to do one boat at a time. And the first boat I'm going to do is this double guy. So I've removed all the paint where the boats are going to be attached here, but on the underside I'm not exactly sure where that's going to line up, so I can't remove that paint. I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy for this, and I like 5-minute epoxy because it seems to work well even when you haven't removed all the paint, and I know that in 5 minutes it's going to be dry. The disadvantage is it smells terrible. So I'm waiting on this third one because it has this loop where the rope comes over this one and into the loop and then over this one. So he's got to go in last. So I'm going to wait for these guys to dry, and then I'll finish tying them off, and then we'll add the last boat. So that's it for the lifeboats. The lifeboats are in place. I just have these last knots that are waiting to dry, and then I'll trim these ropes off. There's clothespins holding those tight. I know I complain about the fit of these parts a lot. The lifeboats were another problem. You can see here on this lifeboat, the benches did not really fit into the body of the lifeboat. The body of the lifeboat has this edge showing, whereas on this lifeboat, that didn't happen. It fit together perfectly. So a couple of the lifeboats fit together, a couple of them didn't. I'm working on the bow, and I'm on step 17, and we have these two parts, which are called the left and right head timbers. I know that because there's actually a sheet that tells you the name of every part in the kit. And then there's this part, which is called the head grate. And I could not figure out from the instructions how this all went together. So it turns out that these two get cemented together, touching here and touching here and touching here, but there's a gap here, and that gap goes around this little section right there. And there's little notches here that fit in 2 holes there on the bow. And then finally, there's pins on either side here that fit in little holes here. So that's how this piece finally gets fit into place. And then this piece kind of fits down in there. Something like that. I hope it's like that. The instructions said to paint gold along the edges of the head timbers. I did do that, but when I look at the box, how they did it, they just painted everything black. And I think I like that better, so I'm going to go back and repaint this all black and get rid of all the gold. The reason the gaps are there is because I was doing a lot of filing to get these pieces to fit. So I'm going to repaint those and then glue this into place, and hopefully this will work out. I've repainted the head timbers. I found out that you can't really paint over the gold paint, so I had to reprime it and then paint it again. And I'm ready to glue it onto the bow here, and it seems to fit well. And again, I'm using 5-minute epoxy. There's actually not a lot of surface area in contact. And I want a good strong fit. It does seem to just sit there. I don't think I need to clamp it. So that is the position. So we'll let that dry. Then we'll add the grate. Well, the next step is tying threads onto these stanchions. And unfortunately, when I was sanding one of them, it snapped in 2 places. To glue it back together, I first put on a couple pieces of wire and decided that that probably wasn't strong enough. So then I glued a piece of plastic strip to the bottom. That's going to make it fit weird on the ship, so we'll see what happens eventually. I'm not even convinced that it's possible to put threads on these. Each of these is supposed to have 3 layers of thread, or 3 levels of thread on each of the stanchions. So we'll see what happens with those. That's the next thing for me to start on. I really thought that attaching the threads onto these stanchion pins was going to be impossible, but it turns out it's actually pretty easy. So what I did here is I taped the stanchion assembly onto a stick. This happens to be a paint stirrer from Lowe's, but you just need something to support it. I'm using this thin green masking tape just to hold that on there so I can remove it easily later. And I tied off the thread at the first loop, and I've been going around. And so there's 3 tiers, and I'm on the final tier, the 3rd tier on the last side, so I'm almost done with this one. The stick I have taped to a couple of 1, 2, 3 blocks to keep it from moving too much. Come up with any other way that you want to do this. I tried clamping it to the desk for a while. That worked as well. And the other thing to note is that I still have the thread on the spool. On this end, I am not bringing the thread back through the eye hole like you're supposed to. I'm just continuing it around the stanchions because I don't really believe that the eye hole is big enough to take the thread that many times. So in terms of tools, I have 3 tweezers. You need a clamping tweezer and then 2 regular tweezers. They could be clamping tweezers if you want, but you need at least 1 clamping tweezer. And I'm going to use that to hold the thread on each pin as I progress up the side. So what I'll do is I will use the tweezers to wrap it around the pin. I then take a toothpick and dip it in a little bit of white glue and touch it on the where the rope is wrapped around the pin, and then move on to the next pin. So that's it. That's the final side. I'm going to let the glue dry before I tie it into the eye hole. Typically, I'll do a side and let the glue dry and then go back and do another side, and so it takes 6 sort of stages to do the entire piece. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you don't want so much tension on the rope that you are going to warp the piece, make it kind of bend up, because you're going to have to glue it flat onto the ship. So you want the rope tight, but not too tight that it bends the piece. So still got some more pieces to do, and then we'll get on to the next assembly. At this point, I've done 3 of the 4 sets of stanchions. The 4th one that I haven't done yet is the one that I broke, and I'm not sure what I'm going to do about it yet. I might buy a new kit. I might try and work with it as it is. We'll see what happens. Now I'm on this part, which is another stanchion, and there's 4 of these, and each of these gets 2 layers of rope. One of the problems is this part is very thin and flimsy, not at all very stable, and it also has a lot of flash on it, so I'm really afraid I'm going to break it. I was looking at the box art, and I noticed that they actually did not put the ropes on this piece. So there's 4 of these pieces. They didn't put the ropes on any of them. So I'm going to try and put the ropes on and see how I do. So on this one I have the first layer in, and I'm going to come back and do the 2nd layer coming back around. So that's one set of the stanchions, 1 out of 4 with the ropes on it. So we'll see if I can get the other 4 done without breaking any of the parts. This is where I am. At this time I've completed on this side. All the stanchions are in place. I have the rails in place with their ropes, and I've added the channels on this side. The next thing I'm going to do is do the other side. I need to add the rails, and I need to add the stanchions for the one that was broken. For the broken one, I just ended up gluing some strip plastic on the bottom, so it's a little bit thicker than the others, but it's not very noticeable. So here's the last remaining stanchion set to go in. I've scraped the paint off of both sides, so I'm going to use normal model cement. And the last ones I did, they just went on pretty smoothly with no trouble, so let's hope this one does too. There's not really a way to clamp this in there. Fortunately, I just started using this Tamiya cement, and I really like it. It dries pretty fast and sets pretty fast. I think that's pretty good, so let that dry. Come on, you. Let that dry, and then we'll come back and we'll do the railings. Well, it's time now for me to add the railings. So there's 2 railings, an outside and an inside, and it's pretty much impossible to scrape the paint off from these little indentations where the posts sit. Now the posts don't have any paint on them because that's where they're cut off the sprue. But since I am gluing on the paint, I'm going to try and use this Plastisap. I used it on the other side, seemed to work pretty well. So we'll let that dry and then we'll add in the second one. I finally got the fourth railing attached. I ended up using 5-minute epoxy, and it is kind of a glue mess. It's unfortunate that the first three went on just fine and the fourth one was so troublesome, and it's kind of collapsed into the other railing. The gap is kind of missing. All through the assembly we had these 3 strings on each side hanging down that they went in after the gun deck, and they were all getting tangled up, and I wasn't sure of what the best way was to keep them sort of organized. And I finally decided that if I tape them around packing peanuts, it'll work. I didn't want to use anything hard because I knew these would be banging against the side of the ship all the time. So packing peanuts is a good solution. So now it's time for me to attach these things. These are called channels, and they go on the sides. And fortunately, they just sit right in, so you don't need to clamp them or anything. So on this side, I was able to scrape off all the paint, but scraping off the paint on the hull is probably not an option. So I'm going back to the plastic super glue. And I did these on the other side and didn't have any trouble, so we'll try it again here. The pieces on the bottom where it hits the hull, I think that they just sit there, and if there's too much of a gap, these actually bend pretty easily. So I have one more of these to attach, and then I have a bunch of eye bolts to stick into the hull all around, and a couple other pieces. And then I'm going to need to do some touch-up painting, and I'm probably going to spray it with some dull coat, and then I'm going to start on the masts. So in the process of attaching the eyelets and this part here, I realized I made a mistake on both sides. So on this side, this rope is supposed to come out of this hole, and then this part goes right there. On this side, this is an eyelet hole. The rope was supposed to come out of this hole. And then I made the same mistake over here, except lower. The rope was supposed to come out of this hole, and then that part would go in these 2 holes. So I guess I just leave the part off. Not sure what else to do, but wrong hole problems again. At this point, I've attached the bowsprit and the jib boom. I had to look up the names for these things. I have this mast is in place. This one gets bound in here, and I think I tied it so tight that it broke the where it was glued in. So it's a little bit loose. I'm gonna have to fix that. The bowsprit, I just inserted it. I didn't glue it. It just fit. It was really snug, and I think I got it in as far as I can go. The step I'm at now is tying these ropes that hold the bowsprit in place, and they go through this thing here called the gammoning hole. I'm on step 24 in the instructions. And the first time I went through and did a couple of these, I would realize I was coming up on this side, I was coming up out of the wrong hole and going around the bowsprit. So I could have left it the way it was, but I decided to cut it and come back and do it correctly. The real challenge here is getting the thread through this gammoning hole, which is right here. The thread just doesn't want to, necessarily go through. So I tried sticking the thread through a needle, but this thread is just too big to go through any of the sewing needles I had. So one option would have been to just use black sewing thread and tie this, but I decided to do it this way, using the thread that came with the kit. So to make this work, I wrapped about an inch of the end of the thread in white glue and let that dry, and that stiffened up the thread to make it through the hole. And I've done about 3 loops, and let's see if I can get another loop in here. It does help to wet the thread, even though it has the glue on it. And there's really nothing you can do. I tried using really narrow tweezers to pull it through, but you shove it through the hole and keep trying until it comes out the other side. And the more threads you get in there, the harder it gets because there's less room. I think that's it. I think I've done 4 loops, and I'm going to say that that's enough. It says to do 6 or 7, but I think that's good enough. They just get harder to do with each loop. So I'm going to tie this off, and then I'm supposed to tie these turns around those. Probably not that difficult, but I know that's not going to be at all visible, so I'm just not going to worry about it. I'm just going to tie this off and move on to the anchors. Here is a close-up of that section. The thread goes through here, through this floorboard area, and up around the bowsprit. Before I put the bowsprit in, I sprayed the ship with dull coat, and that got rid of most of the glue spots that I had, even the area with the railing where I had knocked over the railing and got glue all over the deck. That's pretty well hidden now, so I didn't have to repaint the deck. I just thought I would show this. I'm prepping the anchors for paint, and this is the amount of filings that came off just these 4 pieces that make up the anchors. So pretty significant amount of sanding and filing that is required to get these pieces ready for paint. The mistakes keep adding up. I found out I used the wrong rope for the anchor rope. I'm supposed to use this thick rope, and I used the regular tan rope. I could have just left it as the regular tan rope and put the anchors on, but I think what I'm going to try and do is fish the thick rope through the holes. What I've done is I've tied the tan rope around the end of the thick rope, and I also put some white glue on the end to keep that from fraying, and I also glued the tan rope onto the thick rope, and I'm going to try and fish that through. I got that taken care of. I got my anchors painted, just ready to attach the anchors. I got the one anchor tied on with my makeshift loop made out of wire that I looped through the anchor, and it was more of a struggle than I thought it was going to be. Looking at the instructions, it looks like it's going to be really simple to just tie these knots in, but it actually didn't go that smoothly. So now I'm going to try the other one. This one still has the plastic ring, so I'm going to try it without, see if I can do it without breaking the ring. This piece of rope still has the string where I pulled it through the hole in the hull, and I think I'm going to try and use this string, since it's already glued in there, to wrap to seize the rope, as they say in the instructions. I think that looks like a good length. So what I've been trying to do is clamp this. Maybe I'll try a clothespin this time. And then you kind of want to prop it up somehow. So I got the first knot tied. I'm using the tweezer to keep tension on it while I glue it. Then I'll put a clothespin on the other side. So that keeps tension on the knot, and then I'll let the knot dry, and then I'll come back and complete the wrapping. Now with the knot dry, I can try and wrap the string around the rope. It's a little bit awkward to hold it. So you can see, having the anchor there, I have to wrap around the anchor, avoid the anchor when I wrap. You can't really see it, but the anchor is balanced on the other side, so and the tweezer has the tension on the rope. So I'll let that dry, and then I'll tie it off, and then that will be done. That went a lot smoother than I expected. Now the glue is dried, so I should be able to tie the final knot. So even though I glued the knot, even though I glued the string, I'm still going to tie a knot in it. So that will maintain tension on the knot while it dries. Next, we'll try and tie it up to the hull. So to mount the anchor, one piece of thread goes through this spot here and through this ring, and then another piece of thread ties it up here, I believe. Goes around this post, and I guess the anchor is supposed to sit kind of in there. So I think I'm going to tie this one first. the anchors tied on, I looked at the instructions and realized that I actually tied them incorrectly. So I went back and redid this one following the instructions. But on this side, I just decided to leave it as it is for now. I might come back and retie it. It hangs down pretty low. So I'll think about that. And in the meantime, it's time to start on the masts.